And finally, we are back with the long overdue episode 16 of Chrontendo. Sorry we were away for so long, but sometimes these things just happen. It'll never happen again, I promise. At any rate, once again we have another 15 games for the Famicom, released mostly in March 1987. However, not all is sweetness and light this episode. In fact, we're moving through an unusually grim patch this time. I'll even be so bold as to say that March 27th is perhaps the worst day for the Famicom we've seen so far, with 4 really horrible games being released all at once. In fact, this whole episode is loaded with crappy games, but it's okay because we've got some good games as well. However, before we get into all that, we're just going to step back for a second and do sort of a little wrap-up of the world of video games at this particular point in time. What follows is just a little summary of what's been going on from around 1984 to 1987. Since 1986 was such an important year for the Famicom, I'd like to step back a bit and take a look at the bigger picture of video gaming around this time, in the mid-1980s. Then, as now, there were 3 major places you could play video games: on consoles, in arcades, and on home computers. After the video game crash of 1983 to 1984, personal computers became the primary platform for playing video games. The Commodore 64 was the biggest selling home computer in the US, and I believe the world, but Apple, IBM, and Atari all had some success with their own computers. Starting in the late 1970s, small computer game companies began springing up, especially in California, and by the mid-1980s, many were releasing games that were selling hundreds of thousands of copies. The main advantage over console games was the format: cheap and readily available floppy disks, as opposed to the more expensive and difficult to make cartridges. Literally anyone could produce a computer game, and during the 1980s, thousands of titles were released for PCs. Some of these companies we're already familiar with, such as Broderbund, who released some huge hits like WorldRunner, Prince of Persia, and Myst in the early 80s and early 90s. EA was a US software publisher that had become hugely successful with its RPGs such as Bard's Tale and innovative titles like Mule. They were known at the time for their deluxe packaging, game boxes that looked sort of like LP covers, and promoting the actual game designers' names. In 1987, they would release their first internally developed game, Skate or Die, and in 1990 they would begin publishing games for home consoles, eventually becoming one of the biggest and somewhat controversial video game publishers in the world. Meanwhile, Sierra Entertainment, another California-based computer game giant, had been releasing a series of very popular graphical adventure games, such as the King's Quest series, Space Quest, and starting in 1987, Leisure Suit Larry. Ironically, they also achieved a huge hit with a port of a Japanese computer game, Fexter, which had previously been released to the Famicom, but they dominated the adventure game market until the arrival of LucasArts in 1987. Some PC game companies were more known for action titles, such as Epix with their Jumpman and Impossible Mission games. They would go out of business before too long, but not before releasing their endlessly ported Winter Games, Summer Games, and California Games series. Still active were older companies such as Activision, as well as the Activision spin-off company Accolade, the infamous Accolade spin-off company Acclaim, which would be founded in 1987, and another Activision spin-off, Absolute, which was formed in 1986. In the UK, where such computers as the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC dominated the video game field, several British video game developers started up, such as Codemasters, Ocean Software, known for their TV and movie tie-in games, US Gold, and of course Rareware. Most of these companies would eventually release titles for the US console market. In 1986, a French computer game publisher, Ubisoft, opened its doors, and another French company, Infogrames, began achieving some success. Infogrames would eventually become an industry giant, buying countless other smaller companies and eventually acquiring the name and intellectual property of Atari themselves. The thing about all these companies is while they began making games for personal computers, which at the time were usually very much different than arcade games or console games, the success of Nintendo started a chain of events resulting in them becoming major players in the Western console market. In Japan, the computer scene and the home console scene were much more closely linked. A number of computer systems had entered the market by the mid-80s, the PC-88, the FM7, but most successfully the MSX. The MSX was not a computer manufacturer, but rather a computer standard introduced by Microsoft, of all people, So this is perhaps equivalent to, let's say, the PC standard, which dominates the market today. Many big electronics companies produced MSX computers: Toshiba, Sony, Samsung, Philips, Yamaha, and so on. There was quite a bit of crossover between MSX and the Famicom, with many publishers and developers releasing titles for both. For example, Konami, Hudson, Square, Enix, and others. Around this time, we see many Japanese computer game companies jumping on board with Nintendo and releasing games for the Famicom or the FDS. In 1986, the MX2 was released, which had improved gaming capabilities. Perhaps the most famous MSX game was Metal Gear, released in 1987 by Konami and ported a little bit later to the Famicom. So throughout the mid-1980s, the MSX remained Nintendo's prime competitor in the video game field. While arcade games weren't quite the phenomenon that they were in the early 80s, they were still a major part of the video game industry. The years 1985 through 1987 saw quite a revolution in arcade games. Older game manufacturers released newer, improved hardware, such as Sega's System 16 board or the Namco System 1 and 2. Meanwhile, younger companies such as Capcom and SNK had emerged to challenge the older giants. In racing games, the old top-down view was slowly being phased out in favor of the first-person view, with the emergence of more convincing 3D effects in games like Konami GT or Sega's Hang-On and Outrun. Shoot-'em-ups, one of the longest-lived arcade genres, got a new lease on life with such innovative titles as Gradius, Capcom's 1941-1942 Sidearms, and 1987's R-Type from Irem and Twin Cobra from Toplin. Taidou continued to develop more old-school style games, with hits like Arkanoid and Bubble Bobble, and Atari brought 4-player action into arcades in a big way with Gauntlet. Emerging genres were beginning to develop, for example the beat-em-up, with Technos' Renegade and Double Dragon from 1986 and 1987 respectively. The run and gun first got its start with Commando in 1985 and was fully formed by the release of Konami's Contra in 1987. The one-on-one fighter was slowly making some progress, with Capcom's first Street Fighter game coming out in 1987 as well. And the side-scrolling platformer continued to make its presence known with Sega's Wonder Boy games and Shinobi, as well as Capcom releases like Ghosts and Goblins and 1987's Bionic Commando. Most of the big arcade hits would be ported to the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System, but arcade hardware had advanced to the point where a 4-year-old system like the Famicom could not accurately reproduce arcade games. So 1986 saw the Famicom's focus change from arcade ports to original titles, with both established arcade companies and newer publishers developing titles especially for the Famicom. We'll continue to see arcade ports of Japanese computer games, and even the odd US computer port account for a pretty good percentage of releases, however. But undoubtedly the biggest development for the Famicom is the success of the NES in the United States. Test marketed in New York City in late 1985, the system was released nationwide in 1986 and was a substantial hit, becoming a must-have Christmas item and selling about 1 million copies that year. One big landmark in 1987 was more games. As you might recall, Nintendo launched the system with 18 titles, 2 of which were licensed from Irem. Throughout 1986, Nintendo released 7 more titles, mostly back-catalog games, like Donkey Kong 3 and Popeye. But fall of '86 saw the first handful of titles from third-party publishers, namely Bandai, Data East, and Capcom. Still, by the year's end, the Nintendo Entertainment System had barely over 30 games available, many of which had been out in Japan for a couple years. 1987 saw the number of games increase to almost 100, with many more publishers releasing titles. Konami was quick to release Gradius, Track and Field, and Russian Attack, and even Castlevania. Data East released a couple more titles in mid-year of 1987. SNK released Akari Warriors in May. Temco debuted with Rygar in July, and Taidou with Elevator Action, Legend of Kaja, and Arkanoid in August. Nintendo released a few additional titles in March before finally bringing out the big guns, Zelda in July, and Metroid and Kid Icarus in August. Zelda was a huge hit in the US and established the Famicom as, even more firmly, the #1 console. The second half of 1987 saw the NES debuts from Sunsoft, Irem, and FCI. Major players missing were Hudson, Jaleco, and most famously Namco, who wouldn't release an NES title themselves until the very end of the system's lifespan. Finally, late 1987 saw a few non-Japanese companies release their first games for the Nintendo. Broderbund, Rare, Activision, Atari under their Tengen imprint, And unfortunately, 1987 sees the birth of US-based low-quality publishers such as Acclaim and LJN. The sudden popularity of video game consoles caused a few other companies to throw their hat into the ring, even though Nintendo still ended up with about 90% of the market. There are several now forgotten consoles, such as the Tomy Puta Jr. or the Gakken Compact Vision, but only 2 companies had any success at all, Atari and Sega. The Atari 2600 was technically still around, with a few new releases trickling out, if you can believe that. And in June 1986, Atari dusted off a never-released system from 1984 and put it on the market as the Atari 7800. However, the lack of third-party support helped kill the system. And simply put, the 7800 mostly featured ports of already available games and didn't really have any killer app-type titles such as Super Mario Bros. Sega released the SG-1000 Mark III in Japan in 1985 and had a redesigned version on the US market by Christmas of 1986 as the Sega Master System, presumably to compete with Nintendo's NES. While technically superior to the NES, the Master System never really took off in the US or Japan. This was due to, once again, the fact that third-party developers were locked into restrictive contracts with Nintendo, and the lack of a system-selling game, poor marketing, and what is probably, in the US, the worst game packaging for any video game console ever. Chrontendo has now launched a new series, Chron-Sega, which will play through the releases for the Master System. The first 2 episodes, covering 1985 through early 1987, are already available. So, 1987 begins with Nintendo continuing to dominate the Japanese market, as well as reinvigorating the console scene in the United States as well. However, some change was definitely in the air. Hudson Soft, who had been releasing a lot of games for the Famicom, was developing a brand new video game chip system, the C62. This chip was superior to the ones found inside the Famicom or the Sega Master System and would help usher in a new era of home video games. But that is a story for another time. This episode of Chrontendo is sort of a weird one, so it's fitting that we start with sort of a weird game. Pony Canyon's Law of the West is a port of the 1985 Commodore 64 game, originally developed by Accolade. Not much has been changed, other than the dialogue being translated into Japanese. Law of the West could probably be classified as a text adventure game with animated illustrations at the top. You play the game by selecting one of several responses to each question asked. Certain responses will give you positive results and others will give you negative results. After the character walks away, your score is tallied up. Now, other than just selecting answers to questions, there is a little bit of gameplay involved. If you move the selection all the way up to the top, you'll draw your gun and then you can use the D-pad to move around the gun sight. Once a level, some dude dressed up like Tom Wolfe appears in the background and you can shoot him for bonus points. There are a few other things in the game as well. If your conversation with a doctor goes well, like it has here, he'll heal you if you get shot, rather than the game simply ending when a character guns you down. And incidentally, if your conversation goes really bad, some characters will shoot you, and if you are feeling sort of ruthless, you can simply gun them down as well. By a strange little coincidence, Law of the West sort of resembles Kemco's Time Stranger, released late in 1986 and covered a couple episodes ago. Both were sort of dialogue-based adventure games, though of course the original version of Law of the West definitely predates the Kemco game. There I've just shot down the character instead of conversing with him. Now the original Commodore 64 game has its fans, and it's probably that version to try, as most of the game's entertainment value comes from the sometimes rather amusing dialogue. Here, as you can see, I've actually been shot by picking the wrong responses for that particular character. I guess in a strange way, though, Law of the West does sort of act as a distant ancestor to the countless Japanese visual novel type games, where basically you have an animated sequence,
and then you choose dialogue options and then sort of move forward that way. Quite a few of these things were released over the years in Japan. In 1987, however, Law of the West was a bit of an oddity. On the FDS, it's another release from DOG, which, as you might recall, is an imprint from Square, which was created specifically to release FDS games developed by Square and other independent developers. This is the third DOG game released, Tobadasa Dai Sakuzen meaning Big Battle. Most notably, the creative team behind this game is Hironobu Sakaguchi, Nobuo Uematsu, and programmer Nazu Gabelli. These guys would later go on to make Rad Racer and Final Fantasy, games which I believe were perhaps slightly more successful than this one. Once you get past the various loading screens and introductions and the game proper actually starts, you will see that Tobadasa Dai Sakuzen is a pretty blatant ripoff of Sega's Space Harrier. Space Harrier was released to arcades in 1985 and was one of the earliest games to convincingly simulate 3D using Sega's superscalar technology. While Square's game doesn't look nearly as nice as Space Harrier, it's pretty impressive from a technical standpoint. Several Famicom games, most notably racing games, did employ some pseudo 3D effects, but there was nothing out there at the time that did quite as well as this game. The actual gameplay is a little different than Space Harrier. Your character can't fly, only jump, and infrequently acquire some sort of weapon. There are also power-ups hidden in the columns that sometimes appear. One of them is a mushroom, which, unlike Super Mario Bros., will actually kill you if you get it. However, some parts, such as the end-level bosses here, are ripped off pretty much directly from Space Harrier. As you might recall, that game also featured a boss that was sort of a dragon made out of several sprites connected together. This game actually got a pretty quick release on the American NES. Later in 1987, it got a US release by Acclaim as 3D WorldRunner. This game certainly shows off the power of the Nintendo Entertainment System, but I really wish that more thought and originality was put into the game itself, rather than just into the technical aspects. Though if nothing else, Tobadasa Dai Sakuzen is definitely a step in the right direction for Square. Well, our big disappointment this episode is City Adventure Touch, Mystery of Triangle, which, as the credits note, was developed by Compile. Compile is noted for some high-quality releases for companies that usually don't produce high-quality releases, so they had somewhat high expectations going in. As it turns out, this game is based on, surprise surprise, a popular manga series by Mitsuru Adachi, which was also made into an anime around this time. Touch was sort of a teenage soap opera comic based around high school baseball. If you're thinking, hey, this sounds like kind of a weird idea for a Famicom game, well, I guess you are in agreement with the makers of the Touch game, because what this actually is an action-adventure proto-beat-em-up, which really has nothing to do with the original comic book series. The main characters of the comic, Kazuya, Tetsuya, and Minami, stroll around town fighting these little elves, as well as robots, tiny tanks, and so on and so forth. You can enter shops and buy some basic items, and at some point you can even sort of power up so where you can throw baseballs, as opposed to just punching everything. The game seems to resemble Konami's earlier Ganbara Goemon game, though it really doesn't seem to make any sense. Again, the comic book was a more or less realistic in terms of Japanese soap opera comic books. Look at high schoolers, so the weird sort of science fiction bizarre elements don't really seem to make any sense in the context of what this is about. You actually control two characters at once. The twin brothers, they move in unison and punch at the same time. As you can see, they have health bars there up in the upper right and upper left corner. It's really a bit of a shame that Compile developed such an inferior title in this. It seems to be mocked in Japan for having no relation to the original comic series. While normally Compile's work is very good, technically speaking, this game really not so much so. There's quite a bit of sprite flicker on this thing from time to time, and in the past, Compile had been able to do games like Xanic, which had tons of sprites and almost no flicker at all. City Adventure Touch was actually published by Toho, the major Japanese movie and TV studio. In the US, they're known primarily for their Godzilla movies as well as other giant monster movies, but in Japan they're a mainstream media company that makes all kinds of movies, and as well as other things like anime series, and I believe they actually made the Touch anime series, which is why they put out this game. And for their first Famicom game, they are definitely not off to a good start. Pay attention to this opening scene here because this is the best part of the whole game. Oh, these guys are awesome. Yes, this is Hana no Star Kaidou, and this is another horrible game. Though you really have to admire anyone who can walk around wearing hot pink shoes like that. Well, this is courtesy of Victor, the music company, and developed by Lord knows who. I'm sure they don't want to take credit on this, and in this game you play these two musicians who, well, jump around over motorcyclists and other people in front of what appear to be McDonald's, and there's some basic platforming. They are attacked by enemies, which mostly seem to be just sort of regular people, which they can eliminate by firing little musical notes at them. I will admit the animation of them firing the musical notes is kind of awesome. Suddenly they whip out of nowhere like a little microphone stand or something like that. I believe the plot of this game is that you are traveling across Japan, gaining musical stardom, and limiting, I guess, any sort of person, fan, or other musician who happens to cross your path. This is an interesting and weird premise for a game, but the game itself is pretty much utterly worthless, and this is another fine example of what the Japanese would call kasoga, meaning a shitty game. Oh, grabbing the little electric guitar there will make you temporarily invincible. Among other things, you collect gold records and so on and so forth. Altogether, there are 6 levels. I guess you just sort of run around Japan to various Japanese areas. Here we start in Harajuku, and you actually end up in New York City, which I guess is sort of every Japanese pop band's ultimate goal. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this game is the fact that you can control how close the characters are, just like in the Mickey Mouse game from Hudson. These sort of move together and have to jump together. Pressing up and down on the D-pad will make them move further apart or closer apart. Most of the challenge in the later games is sort of doing all this weird platforming with these two guys at once. Other than that though, this is for the most part a completely worthless game. Our first big game this episode is from Konami, surprise surprise. It's Goonies II, Fratelli no Saigo Chosen, a sequel to Konami's 1986 Famicom game. And like a lot of Konami games, Goonies II is a quality-made title. Look at this very nice animated intro here, as Ma Fratelli explains the plot to you. This sequel is much longer than the original Goonies game, so it does allow the option of continuing. The Goonies was, of course, the much-loved 1985 movie concerning the adventures of a gang of ragtag kids and their run-ins with a criminal family known as the Fratellis. Naturally, pirate treasure was involved. The story of the first Goonies game sort of resembled that of the movie, but Goonies 2 takes off in a completely off-the-wall direction, I guess, well, sort of like Konami's King Kong 2 game. Here you're rescuing the other Goonies who've been captured by the Fratellis, but also there's Annie the Mermaid, Eskimos, underwater scuba diving sequences, little old wizard guys who live underground, all kinds of things completely unrelated to the film. Now, Goonies 2 is a mostly side-scrolling platformer like the first game, but with a catch, there are these first-person adventure game-like sequences added in when you enter a door. In this room I found the keys necessary to open safes and jail doors. You'll need to collect a lot of these kind of things in the game. Other items you'll need to collect: a hammer for smacking on walls, various sorts of shoes, other weapons such as the slingshot or the boomerang, special glasses, scuba gear for going underwater, special kinds of armor, all sorts of silly little things appear in this game. You can use the hammer to, as I mentioned, look for hidden things in the walls. Now the game starts off in the Fratellis. I believe this is actually their basement I'm going into right here. This is much like the first Goonies game, but this sequel is much bigger, so much so that you actually need an in-game map, seen here. Notice it's labeled Front. Going through the doors will connect you to the back section of the game, which effectively doubles the size of Goonies 2. Altogether, front and back, I believe there's around 150 rooms, not counting the various first-person rooms. In order to get around, you'll frequently be sort of moving back and forth between the front and the back sections. And of course there are tons of hidden rooms, passages, items, all kinds of things that you'll have to find. Not to mention the simple fact that finding your way around the Goonies 2 world can be pretty tricky. I've just found a magic locator device. Now, as you can gather from the video, the platforming and the fighting in Goonies is really not that difficult. This is definitely not Mega Man. See here, now I'm in the back section. This is again in the Fratelli's hideout, but notice it's a slightly different color. Now here I've actually found one of the jailed Goonies. You need the keys to get him out. You need to collect all 6 and then of course rescue your friend Annie the Mermaid, who of course was not in the movie at all. So Goonies is not really like a Mega Man style platformer, it's more sort of one of those, what the hell do I do now kind of games. It's completely non-linear and you really have to sort of walk over the place looking for random items. You have these sort of Zelda-like hermit folks who live in the rooms who give you hints. Well, they're sort of hints I suppose. Sometimes they send you on little fetch quests to look for items. Now if you were to play Goonies 1 and 2 back to back, you'd see the way that games were starting to change between early 1986 and 1987. Here we come to the ubiquitous, well not quite yet ubiquitous, ice level, last seen in Konami's Esper Dream. But around this time the influence of Zelda and Metroid are becoming pretty obvious in games like this. Whereas Goonies 1 was pretty linear, albeit with some exploration involved, Goonies 2 is all about finding hidden items that will allow you to access otherwise inaccessible areas, like the scuba diving suit, shoes that allow you to jump higher, so on. These are all found, as I mentioned, in the first-person sections, and like I said, you often have to use the hammer to smash a hole and find the hidden door. There are, of course, the little Zelda-esque like men found in these rooms, and all this sort of shows that Konami is sort of continuing to move in the direction that it had been going with games like King Kong, sort of more non-linear exploration type games. This particular door is a little tricky to get into. You actually have to land on the platform, then very quickly get in. Never quite sure what the story was on the red rooms. Are the doors rusty or covered in blood? And again, hit everything to look for a hidden room or door. Now here's the thing about Goonies 2. Goonies 1, as we might recall, was never released in the US except in arcades. Oh, here's one of the more interesting parts in the game. Here's the bridge you have to cross. Those little metal skull things will actually steal your boomerang if they hit you, so they're quite annoying. But as I was saying, Goonies 2 was one of the first Konami games to come out for the NES in the United States. It was actually released in late 1987, so it really came out only a couple months after Metroid itself. This means that Goonies II was one of the first sort of non-linear adventure-style platformers seen over here in the US, and because of this I think it's actually received quite a following over the years. However, playing the game now, I can't really say that it works completely all that well. For example, there really isn't... Oh, here's an appearance of a Konami Man right here, naturally. Make sure you don't hit him or he won't fill up your energy. There really isn't a whole lot of variety in the levels, and the overall level design isn't nearly as cool as, say, Metroid or Castlevania. On a purely visual level, Goonies 2 is actually kind of boring, with a few exceptions such as the bridge. Many of the rooms are almost identical. They're sort of the same old basements and caves, with a few other things thrown in as well. The enemies don't really do much except walk back and forth, and the first-person sections, while always short, tend to be annoying and mostly involve hitting every single wall in the room looking for hidden doors. And the interface during the sections is rather clunky. So don't get me wrong, Goonies 2 is one of the better games this episode, and it is, one of the usual high-quality products from Konami, and it's actually quite innovative in its own way. I just don't think everything works quite as well as it could. Though, compared to the next game we're going to see, it's a goddamn masterpiece. If there's any particular genre that hardcore gamers tend to dismiss, it's probably going to be girl games. Like Barbie games, for example. Well, here we have Takara's Lost Word of Jenny, which is sort of like the first Barbie game. What exactly this game is about, I'm not really sure. But it begins with Jenny appearing in this sort of overworld town, and a creepy guy walking by and touching Jenny in an inappropriate way. Who exactly is Jenny, I wonder? Well, Takara, which is the enormous Japanese toy company, also known for creating Transformers, among many other things, had the rights to manufacture Barbie dolls in Japan, though the Takara Barbie, as we see here, was specifically designed to appeal to Japanese girls. Eventually, Takara's rights to the Barbie name expired, so they renamed the doll Jenny. And I believe that the Jenny dolls are still being manufactured and are popular today. This is Takara's second game, after the horrible Transformers Convoy no Nazo, and this game is just as bad and is usually classified as Kosoga in Japan. On this underworld you run around avoiding a dangerous puppy and a guy with a gun and a car looking for the open door. Once you've found it, there are several levels, as you can see. The first one here is sort of a ship level, and you're now treated to some really awful platforming action. The idea is to collect the various objects on this level, barrels in this particular one, looking for the hidden letter or something. Mostly they just contain an enemy instead. Pretty much every aspect of this game is downright awful. Graphics, sound, controls, playability, and why the hell are cute little puppies always attacking Jenny? Here's another level, a flower-themed level. Some of the enemies, such as that grasshopper or locust, whatever that is, are virtually impossible to kill. And the jumping controls are very, very bad. I guess this game gets points just for general weirdness and level design. This level, for example, is cake-themed. But I don't know who designed this game. Transformers was done by ISCO, and this is certainly bad enough to be their work. At any rate, Lost Word of Jenny is almost certainly a game to avoid at all costs. Okay, so Lost Word of Jenny was terrible. I wish I could promise you a better game now, but instead, next up is Winter Games. The title screen is so ugly, they only keep it up there for like half a second. And as you may have noticed there, the magic word, acclaim. Hooray! In Japan, this was released by Pony Canyon for the Famicom Disk System, but later in 1987, it became one of the first US releases from the notorious shipmonger's Acclaim. Which is entirely appropriate because Winter Games is absolutely terrible. So, we have a nice, if somewhat dated-looking animated intro here, and then it'll take you to the menu's options. Winter Games is quite similar to Konami's Track and Field. There are 4 different Olympic sports you can compete in. You can choose your country, though most of the countries that actually do well in the Winter Olympics, like East Germany, Sweden, and Finland so long, are strangely absent. Now this is a port of the 1986 Commodore 64 game, developed by Action Graphics and published by Epix. It was one of the games in Epix's enormously successful series that included Summer Games, California Games, and so on. Despite Epix releasing so many popular titles, they still managed to go bankrupt shortly after this. I can only assume their executives spent all the profits on cocaine and pastel designer suits. Hot Dog Aerials is probably the most non-awful of all the events. You use the D-pad to do various air tricks, and then you get scored based on the quantity and the difficulty of the tricks. Oops. Mostly you just sort of press forward and back on the D-pad to do various kinds of flips and whatnot. Now next up is this, well, really obnoxious racing game here. It's actually just like the Track and Field running games. You have to do some button mashing, only here it's left and right on the D-pad instead of A and B on the control pad. This is actually a lot more obnoxious than having to press the buttons real quick. Also, this race is just way too long. Now, probably the least favorite sport in this Winter Games is the figure skating competition. Much like Hot Dog Aerials, you need to perform a number of tricks and are then graded. But figure skating uses a number of obscure and non-intuitive controller combos to perform tricks. Mostly you just fall down a lot. And by the way, that is one really ugly character graphic used for your skater. Winter Games was ported to the Famicom by Atelier Double, one of those mysterious Japanese contract developers, and apparently a very new company. Winter Games must have been one of their first jobs. Pony Canyon would use them frequently from here on out. It's strange that Pony Canyon is not very discriminating when it comes to their developers. They would just as soon use someone like Atelier Double as they would someone like Compile, who actually knew how to program for the Famicom. I assume you see what I mean by falling down a lot. It does take a certain timing to, there we go. And I even managed to land without falling down. Pretty tricky task. The very last game here is this really awful bobsled. As is typical of computer game design around this time, the screen is taken up by these unnecessarily large maps and displays. You know, what you're actually looking at, your figure going down the hill there is that little tiny thing in the upper right corner there. But what exactly is that blue band right above it? Is that supposed to be the sky? So anyway, the bobsled event is sort of a racing game with really bad controls. So Winter Games, sort of a disaster, but we're not done yet. In fact, March 27th, 1987 is probably going to go down as one of the worst days in Famicom history. One of several horrible titles released on the same day as Winter Games is Superboy Allen for the FDS, the second in this series from Sunsoft and Ask Kodansha. Now, I'm not really sure who developed these things or what Kodansha's connection is. Some sources list Asmik as the developer, Asmik being a venture involving the Japanese companies Sumitomo and Kodansha. Ask Kodansha's name does appear on video games occasionally, sometimes in conjunction with Asmik, though I'm not really sure what Ask Kodansha actually does on these games, or who actually developed this game for that matter. Regardless, it certainly does fit into the pattern of shitty games that Sunsoft was releasing. At any rate, about the game itself, it's another silly-looking educational game, this time with a lumberjack theme. You might remember the first game in this series, Adian no Su, involved wandering around Zelda-type dungeons doing math problems. Superboy Allen involves rolling logs while doing math problems, and of course, being chased by giant apples. An excellent example of the let's just throw some random shit together and call it a game school of design. Quite popular at this time. But I'll admit, I didn't really learn to play Superboy Allen, but how can you blame me? Would you want to waste time playing this thing? This looks like a terrible variation on the Eggerland games. Oh yes, and there are actually 2 games on this cart. The second is some sort of running game, once again involving fractions. And once again, you probably won't want to waste much time on these. They make Donkey Kong Jr. Math look like a masterpiece by comparison. Okay, so one terrible educational game from Sunsoft wasn't enough punishment? Well then, let's have another. Your character runs around in circles in a blind panic, desperately wishing he could escape this game. As will you. It is Chisoko Tairiku Orudora, which means something like Underground Continent Orudora. It's all about this little dude who goes underground and jumps over monsters. Now, I thought these Chinu games were supposed to have some sort of educational content to them, but Orudora doesn't seem to have even bothered. I mean, seriously, why? No one bought this thing, I assume. Not sure if that weird little blue line across the top there is supposed to be there or not. Well, as you can see, this is a very simple side-scrolling platformer with an underground theme. Your character, who wears his cap backwards because he's got attitude, carries bombs with which to blow up various life forms living underground. Now, if you're thinking, this all looks very familiar, well, yes, this is just like Atlantis no Nazo, another terrible Sunsoft game that came out back in 1986 and was almost released in the US as Super Pitfall 2. The underground caverns, the bombs, the general lack of anything even remotely exciting. At least Sunset didn't go through all the trouble of coming out with a new idea for this game. Just like in Atlantis no Nazo, it's impossible to pretty much kill anything with those damn bombs. On the plus side, they've dropped the timer, so if you can't run out of time and have to repeat the level. However, they did make all the exits all sneaky and hidden. I found a secret exit at level 3. How many levels are there? No idea. I doubt if anyone's ever bothered to finish this game. But you do get a bonus game on this cart. It is a math racing game with a sexy big-haired cleavage-showing character. I guess this involves racing around Europe by doing math problems. There's no actual racing, it's just math problems. Sunsoft, my friends, please stop making horrible games like this. Promise me this will be the last one, okay? And our fourth bad game, released on March 27th, is Nangoku Shirei, Spy vs. Spy, from Kemco. And obviously, this is a sequel to Spy vs. Spy, and just like the first game, it was ported from a US computer game. In this case, it was 1985's Spy vs. Spy: The Island Caper, the second of 3 Spy vs. Spy games. After selecting your island, you find yourself wandering around these, rather nice-looking desert islands here. Now, the original title was once again developed by First Star, even though who knows who ported this version. One thing they did do was remove the trapulator, the interface that shows you what you have in your possession and allows you to sort of easily switch between your various traps. While the first game was not bad, any fun seems to have been drained out of the sequel. Black and white spies are both trapped on this island looking for missile parts, and as for you to search the island looking for those parts, and you can plant traps for your opponent. Whereas in the first game, items were hidden behind picture frames, in drawers, so on and so forth. In this case, everything is simply buried in the sand. Encountering the enemy spy will once again lead to a fight. When one guy gets the missile, this crazy tune starts playing. That player then needs to find the sub and get away, which he does with a hot chick in tow, no less. I'll admit, from a graphical standpoint, Nangoku Shirei looks better than the first game, but the game itself is boring and pointless, so it's really just another utterly forgettable release from Kemco. Okay, so we've just had 4 bad games, all released on the same day, and I know you're thinking, man, this is like the worst episode of Chrontendo ever, but I'm actually going to make it up to you right now, because on that very same day, Otocky was released. And Otocky is awesome, something completely different than what we've seen for the Famicom before. Released by ASCII, and apparently developed by Cedric, whoever they are, Otocky is a horizontal shoot-'em-up with a musical theme. However, rather than using a typical cannon or laser, Otocky has this weird balloon thing, which behaves as if it were on a bungee cord. When you shoot it out, it then snaps back and returns to you. You can shoot it in 8 directions using the D-pad. It's useful both for killing enemies and collecting items, like the various notes that you are attempting to collect. In Otocky, your object is to collect those notes and fill up the meter in the lower middle of the screen there. You also collect A and B items, and that will change the sound of the music and give you a limited use secret weapon fired by using the B button. And the music is the great thing about Otocky, since firing a weapon works kind of like playing a musical instrument. This is almost like a combination between like a synthesizer and a shoot-'em-up. It's almost sort of a predecessor to games like Rez. Otocky was in fact the first game designed by Toshio Iwai, the sound artist and the man behind games such as the popular Electroplankton. Now, Otocky is enormously fun to play, and probably the only shooter where you want to fire a gun for no reason, even if there's nothing to shoot at. There are some annoyances, like the fact that your weapon becomes smaller as you take damage, thus making the game harder every time you get hit. And the boss battles are not very satisfying. We're coming up upon one here. Once you've collected enough notes, you'll then face the boss, and then you'll fire the collected notes into the little holes in the gigantic musical notes. It's actually a little lame, and not nearly as fun as the other regular levels. Now, since Otocky is sort of like a musical-based game here, I'm going to do something unheard of in Chrontendo so far, which is I'm actually just going to shut up and let the game sort of speak for itself for a couple of minutes, and I'll then turn up the volume for you. So, in conclusion, Otocky is a super fun game, and pretty much arrived completely out of the blue. It's a real lost classic for the FTF, and if you do play sort of one of these almost unknown Japanese-only games for the Famicom or FTS, I mean, for God's sake, play this one. Some things in this world are just so dependable. The sun will rise and set, spring will follow winter, and every episode of Chrontendo, Bandai will release another uninspired platformer based on a licensed property. Last episode it was Ultraman, this time it's Dirty Pair Project Eden, based on, you guessed it, a manga, anime, and animated feature film. Dirty Pair is about these two ladies who are space cops, but they are all sexy. Sometimes they have to wear skimpy outfits. Project Eden was a 1987 animated feature, and this game is supposedly based on that film. This was, of course, not released in the United States, but this unofficial English translation allows us to read the plot setup. We saw the guy a few moments ago giving the girls the lowdown on what they're supposed to do. Then you are into the forced side-scrolling action. You can get crushed between blocks and the edge of the screen there. Grab that perfume bottle, and then your buddy will show up, and with the ship. And then you can fly around and shoot things, and grab various objects. Stars, hearts, headphones, visors, so on and so forth. This is back when power-ups really didn't have to make any sense. They could just be sort of these weird random objects. And game designers hadn't yet standardized their iconography, so hearts, for example, don't refill your health in this game. Now, in all fairness, while Dirty Pair is not a good game, the anonymous developer, perhaps this Ujix fellow, mentioned at the bottom of the screen, saw fit to alternate shoot 'em up and platformer action. World 1 is all shoot 'em up like, as we see here. World 2 is more adventure-y and maze-like, a series of interconnected rooms. Altogether there are 4 worlds, and if you have the patience to get through all 4, then good for you. We finally arrive in April with our last game this episode, and it's an odd one, Sanma no Meitantei. First of all, check out this really cool opening cinematic. The opening sequences of video games are slowly getting cooler and cooler. As you might guess from watching the game itself, this is yet another murder mystery-based adventure game. But with a difference. You will hopefully remember Beat Katano's video game from Chrontendo episode 13. Well, this game also stars a popular Japanese TV personality comedian, Sanma Akashiya. Not very well known in the West, this guy is hugely popular in Japan, one of Japan's biggest pop culture celebrities. His main distinguishing physical characteristic is his gigantic set of front teeth. Now, Sanma no Meitantei will look familiar to those who've seen the earlier adventure games of the Famicom, Portopia, Suisho no Ryu, and so on. You have a bunch of icons that serve as your main action menu. There's ones for move, examine, and so on. But this game really kind of goes out on a limb compared to most of the earlier games in this genre. You have a top-down overworld where you can move around from location to location. Currently I'm in some sort of a graveyard here. But what really sets it apart are the little mini-games scattered throughout the world. Here, in order to get that quest object at the side of the screen, you have to dodge all those falling objects. While this is certainly not completely unhinged like the Beat Katano game was, there is a goofy, almost postmodern kind of feel to it. For example, another minigame uses the extremely recognizable sound effects from Pac-Man, which of course was also from Namco. And there is a sort of typical Japanese perverted sense of humor as well. At one point, when searching this girl's room, you can find her panties in the bed. For some reason, you use a little crab to point out where you want to search. So, surprisingly, this doesn't seem like just another crappy game that uses like a famous person in it. Namco apparently put a lot of effort into this, and it actually looks quite interesting. Of all the Japanese-only Famicom games we've covered so far, this seems really like it might be a good candidate for a translation. Until then, however, I guess it's going to have to settle to be sort of one of those intriguing-looking yet still undiscovered Famicom games. We now come to what is certainly the strangest entry this episode, Appletown Story, Little Computer People, published by DOG and ported by Square from a 1985 US computer game known as just Little Computer People. This was originally designed by David Crane and Activision. And I will admit my favorite part of the game is the rather charming intro with a great musical theme. The music is credited to none other than Nobuo Uematsu. We'll take a second just to listen to the music here, and you may have noticed the rather primitive speech intro in the game there. So, what sort of game is this? Well, it's sort of an early god game slash artificial life simulation. Takes place entirely inside this house where this young girl and her cat live. You get to rather voyeuristically spy on her actions and have a certain amount of control over what she does. If this sounds a little like The Sims, then yes, it is. Will Wright has confirmed that the old Commodore 64 game, Little Computer People, was one of the inspirations for The Sims. Now, there are some strange differences. Appletown Story occasionally gives us these weird cutscenes, like close-ups, which are a little weird. There she was, brushing her teeth. Now, you can interface with the girl using the control bar up at top. For example, you can make the phone ring, have her to get something to eat, make her play the piano, so on and so forth. And you also have a very limited amount of interaction with her. You can play a game of cards and so on and so forth. You know, she keeps going into that room and bringing something out, and I've never really been able to figure out exactly what it is. Obviously that's not the fridge, so she's not getting something to eat. Here we see her pick the phone. Notice the rather gratuitous bend-over panty shot there. Something that was definitely added to the Japanese version. In the US version, your character was always male. So here we see her talking to the girl. It looks like she's sort of giving you the double flip-off for some strange reason. And here's one of the little card games that you can play. Now, unfortunately, while this is a pretty unique idea for a game, a little something was lost in the translation. The original Little Computer People had a number of features completely missing from this Famicom port. Oh, here's a little piano playing scene. Again, nice music. Almost kind of looks forward to the piano playing in the Final Fantasy games. In the original version, your character had sort of randomly generated name and stats, and you could actually type a pretty large number of commands in using the keyboard, and he would sometimes react in rather unexpected ways. The whole thing was much more interactive and simulation-like. The Famicom port is more just about watching the girl go about her business around the house. I suppose this is an early example of a PC game being sort of dumbed down for release on a console. Our final game this episode is yet another FDS title, and is once again by Konami, and would become one of the most well-loved early Konami games. It is Konami's early run-and-gun classic, Green Beret, known in the West as Russian Attack. It starts with one of the coolest intro scenes so far. This must have really blown away gamers with its coolness back in 1987. Your mission is to infiltrate what is clearly a Soviet army base and destroy some sort of secret weapon. Now, Green Beret is actually a port of Konami's 1985 arcade game, as we'll see here. In the arcade version, your mission is to rescue some POWs. The home version has been substantially changed. It has more levels for one thing, though one of the things I do miss from the arcade version is the fact that you can obtain that most unhumanitarian of all weapons, the flamethrower. For the American NES release, the game kept its US arcade title, Russian Attack, and there were a few minor changes, such as you start the game with 5 lives instead of 3. However, we'll be going hardcore and playing the original version today. Now, for some reason, despite the fact that you are on an extremely important top-secret mission, your superior decided to go all Metal Gear and send you in without being heavily armed. You spend most of the game with just a small knife. I guess that being an elite Green Beret, you really don't need guns to take on an entire enemy army base. Furthermore, you would never actually dirty your hands by picking up foreign rifles. On occasion, you will grab a bazooka or a grenade. In fact, the bazooka is necessary to finish the game. There is a very rare gun in Russian attack that you can pick up, but it only lasts for a few seconds. Now, the controls in this game do take some getting used to. To jump, you press up on the D-pad. I had earlier dismissed this same control configuration for Capcom's Trojan back in episode 14, but in Green Beret it works. Now, Green Beret is a very straightforward game. It's, I guess, one of the most linear games you can possibly imagine. More than anything else, it's a game about timing. Most enemies you can simply stab, though jumping enemies require you to jump up in the air and hit them in midair. Shooting enemies will require you to duck. It's all very simple, but this game has a reputation for difficulty. It is quite beatable if you play it right. You will need to master the art of killing multiple enemies in one jump, however. Each of the 6 levels ends in a boss battle. The rather easy first level you saw a second ago ends with simply a wave of troops being sent at you. A piece of cake if you decided to use your bazooka like I did. Later levels tend to pick crazier though still somewhat realistic bosses against you. Much like in Castlevania, the bosses can be easy if you battle them correctly. Now there are hidden underground passages in the game, which can be uncovered by blowing up landmines. Of course, why would anyone put down landmines inside of their own base? So there is a very slight element of non-linearity in this game. The levels get consecutively more difficult. This second level here adds shooting enemies to the mix. The secret of the game is not to rush through it, ironic considering the American title, but rather to move forward slowly and methodically, letting the enemies come to you and impale themselves on your knife. Here we're seeing some of the bosses from some of the middle stages in the game. They're really perhaps not as difficult as they might appear to be on first glance. The level design is very simple and really can't compare to anything in Castlevania, but the backgrounds are nicely done, like this little bridge scene here. Everything is very clean looking, yet detailed at the same time. While the entire game takes place on a military installation, each level is distinct looking and there's enough variation to hold your interest. Green Beret isn't really a platforming game, but every level gives you the option of moving along the ground or using ladders to access a higher path. And speaking of ladders, they will be your worst enemy in this game. Jumping while in front of a ladder will cause you to land on the ladder and cling to it, completely vulnerable to enemy attacks, unable to attack or jump off. Likewise, ducking while over a ladder will cause you to climb down it. The moral of the story is, advance slowly and carefully, stop where there are no ladders, then attack. Now here's this final cool level. You saw the very nicely done jets in the background. Remember, the art in this game is great. For the final battle, you must destroy the secret weapon, which turns out to be just a missile of some sort. Since the Soviets had plenty of intercontinental nuclear missiles, what could be so special about this one? Well, you have to shoot it with your bazooka a bunch of times, and if you run out of ammunition, you have to kill enemies and get some more. Since there are so many enemies on this final battle, they flood the screen so completely that you'll have a hard time landing without being killed. So I hope you saved your lives and bazookas for the final boss battle. Well, once you've destroyed the secret weapon, you get one more completely awesome cutscene, and the game congratulates you for bringing world peace. Though it would seem that invading a Soviet army base and blowing up a bunch of stuff would actually more likely increase hostilities and probably start a war. But it's only a video game, and a darn fine one at that. Konami must have liked it because I believe that this, along with Track and Field, was the one of the very first Konami releases in the US for the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Well, that's it. Thanks for tuning in. Boy, once again we really saw Konami kick some ass, huh? Well, tune in next time. We'll actually see a couple obscure games from Konami and Capcom, as well as an all-time classic from Temco. Oh yeah, and also the usual crap.